Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this CIWEM Scottish Branch webinar. My name's Alice Gent, the chair of the CIWEM Scottish Branch, and I just want to say it's so good that so many of you have been able to join us in these unprecedented times, as the saying goes, for this time at the moment, and also that it's wonderful that technology enables us to gather together and continue to share work in the industry. I'm delighted to welcome Barry Hankin, who will be presenting this evening. Barry has 24 years of experience in academia, regulation and consultancy, and is currently the head of environmental modelling at JBA Consulting. Barry has specialised in modelling and management of whole catchment risks, advancing techniques for distributed modelling of nature-based flood and diffuse pollution management to improve understanding of resilience. He led the winning entry to the UK DEFRA flood modelling competition, demonstrating advanced approaches to testing the resilience of natural flood management measures under a range of extreme rainfall scenarios. This built on work he led for the Rivers Trust, involving partner engagement, modelling, uncertainty analysis and visualisation work. In 2018, he helped the Environment Agency build their first national and steady whole catchment water quality HYPE model to investigate the effectiveness of DEFRA's catchment sensitive farming programme. He's also a visiting researcher at LEC Lancaster University, working on the QNFM project investigating the effectiveness of NFM. This evening, he is going to be speaking on his natural flood management work on the Eddleston Water, and would like to acknowledge key partners and others who have worked on the Eddleston Water project prior to this project, including Luke Cummins of Tweed Forum, Professor Chris Spray and Dr. Andrew Black, University of Dundee, and Debbie Garft of the Scottish Government. Please post any questions to Barry via the message feature on Zoom, which is available throughout the presentation, and we'll aim to work through as many as possible. Thank you very much, Barry. Over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Alice. I'm just trying to start my slideshow. There we go. It should be in presenter mode now. And thanks very much for that introduction. Yeah, of course, I'd like to thank the people listed, without whom the modelling work wouldn't be possible, without the hard years of, I guess, obtaining grants and installing NFM, installing monitoring in one of the foremost instrumented catchments in Scotland, with 14 hydrometric sites and an awful lot of NFM installed between 2012 and 2015, including native tree planting, engineered log jams, remeandering, ponds, and so on. Now, the aim of this work was to see if we could represent NFM and understand the whole system response, and whether such a model could be used to represent NFM effectively. So we want to demonstrate how NFM can be appraised alongside other traditional risk reduction methods. So this project was to see how far we could push whole catchment modelling, whole system modelling to understand the responses, and how we could represent NFM. One of the issues, of course, is how do you represent NFM? And there are three major NERC UK studies ongoing at the moment, and I'll refer to those as we go along. So in summary of my talk, I'm going to cover the whole catchment model build and how we selected that through phase 1 of the study, and why we rounded on using HECRAS 2D. It was all about trying to make best use of emerging data sets and understanding which modelling platform could be used by more partners, because this has been a very engaged process, and we want the model to have longevity. We want to be able to share it with people, and HECRAS 2D is one of those models that doesn't need a license from the US Army Corps of Engineers, making it very flexible. I'm going to cover those sort of aspects, and I'm going to get stuck into some of the whole catchment calibration that we've done using that framework. I'm going to kind of skip over more of the sort of decision processes that went into that. But don't be afraid to contact me out with this, because there's a lot of different modelling platforms that could be used. And I'm going to cover the hydrology. So for this study, we looked at design hydrology and event hydrology. We modelled events before and after making use of the distributed monitoring data from the different gauges that the University of Dundee and others have been generating data from since about 2012, 2011. And we sort of covered statistical methods and RefH2 calibration methods so that we could be sure that we were getting the initial antecedent soil moisture right and modelling some real events. There haven't been a whole load of large events apart from this year, which is typical. So after we calibrated the post-NFM scenario, there have, of course, been some larger events like Storm Kira and Dennis in 2020, but more of that in a bit. So what we've done is we have done a degree of model proving using the event data that we have. We have some trash line surveys for a slightly peculiar event in June 2012. And we've made comparisons with observations and tried to sort of show that the model represents the system well. But of course, this could all be done in an uncertainty framework, and we are at this moment running multiple simulations to try and understand the quantum of uncertainty. So we'll talk about also how other projects can learn from this one, and one of the outputs is a user guide with the model. So there'll be the digital deliverables in terms of the HECRAS 2D model and all the data. And that comes with a user guide and a sort of decision tree process for understanding what level of modelling might be needed to appraise NFM in the mix when you're combining it with traditional risk reduction methods. So getting straight into the detail, let's just sort of step back a little bit again. Why did we choose HECRAS 2D? Well, we want to be able to make use of these emerging data sets that have got high resolution topography. So when we've got LiDAR at 0.5 meter for 70 kilometre squared catchment, that means we've got about 280 million pixels. And we've got an awful lot of detail there. And I suppose one of the questions is, well, how do we best make use of that? Such a cell size is quite difficult to model. We can just about do that. We used a similar number of cells in the model of the Eden catchment in the DEFRA flood modelling competition. But it does also take a long time to simulate even on a graphics processing card. So there are emerging techniques, and HECRAS has sort of gone straight in there with version 5 to allow the subgrid topography to be represented in a coarser mesh. So the way it does that is it builds hydraulic tables of the subgrid. So it has a lookup between the level and the storage within that cell, all based on the 0.5 meter resolution DTM. And it does the same across the flow across the faces. So we have conveyance tables against elevation as well. If we move from the sort of pinks inset diagram to the next one on the right, the cut-throughs, those are edited into the DTM where we want to have flow pathway continuity. They could be represented by a culvert, and we do that in some of our work. Here they're represented with cut-throughs. And of course, that has its own implications for uncertainties in terms of the local afflux near to those cut-throughs. But at the moment, we're talking about broad scale modelling of a 70 kilometre squared catchment, and we're bringing in a lot of detail. And then on the bottom left, we've got how do we represent the NFM? And I mentioned earlier that there's 3 NERC-funded projects, including the QNFM project at Lancaster that Nick Chappell's leading, Martin Evans' project in Manchester, and the Landways project down in Reading, led by Joanne Clark. And actually, at least 2 of those are trying to quantify the shifts in parameters in models such as this that are justifiable on the basis of the evidence. And we'll have seen from the Dadson paper in 2017 about how the evidence in terms of monitored evidence suggests that at 10 kilometers squared we might understand the effectiveness of NFM in terms of leaky barriers and woodland and storage and so on. But as you get greater than that, the noise in the system, the environmental variability means that it's very difficult in a larger catchment to understand that change resulting from and attribute it to the NFM, and how you then translate that into the parameter shifts that you use in your model, such as changing the friction using the Manning's roughness. And then if we move over to the right, the lower right mesh refinement diagram, you can see what we have to do in a model like this is also what we gain by the efficiency of having this nice subgrid topographic representation. We also have to add a bit of complexity in terms of representing embankments and major flow paths. So you might want to refine the mesh around the channels or around embankments, ensure that we're not getting flow passing through major embankments or convexities where it shouldn't, and that in itself can be quite a time-consuming job. But if we do that, and then we also prepare, if we move over to the right, we prepare the event hydrology. What we're doing here is we're using the DayMod software or the C&E calibration utility for FH2. And if we manage to prepare that successfully and understand the antecedent wetness in the catchment before an event, then we have a hope of modelling that event, and we can validate that with observations in this nicely instrumented catchment of Eddleston Water. So we have done all those steps, and the diagram on the right, the overlay on the photography is done in QGIS in another free software package, and you can see there that we're getting realistic behavior, but we need to sort of justify that. It might look very photorealistic, but how well does it perform in reality? In terms of the hydrology, which I'll move on to next, we did some event modeling and design hydrology, and I'm sure there's some very fine hydrologists listening today, and they'll probably notice straight away that we have quite a discrepancy between the RFH to estimates and the statistical method estimates of the design hydrology. So just stepping back a bit, looking at the event modeling, we use the FH2 calibration utility. We had to extend the rainfall from the Tweed Forum back a couple of years. That meant that for the earlier events pre-NFM installation, we did have to tie into some more less reliable data, if you like, but we were able to do that reasonably satisfactory, and provide 2 years of antecedent conditions and evaporation data. On the right hand side, you'll see those sort of ratios between the two methods, and you can see there's quite a lot of uncertainty there. There it's not actually been a long-term gauged catchment. So prior to 2012, there might be a level sensor for warning, but there hasn't been a sort of long-term record of flow. And the best gauge from the Tweed Forum that we have is the Kidston Mill gauge, which is the furthest downstream with a rating in Peebles. So there we had sort of typical problems with hydrology. Sort of underlines the high uncertainty in that for a ungauged catchment that's no longer ungauged. And if I just step on, so essentially we took forward the FH hydrology, and we have all the flows. So if we ever need to revert that back to understanding the annual exceedance probabilities, we can do. We can see the process that we went through for some of the events, for the actual real events. So pre-NFM, we had 3 events that we looked at, and this is the best of them, unashamedly. So we had a June 2012 event and a July one. The June one did have a trash line survey for a small part of the catchment, which we although we didn't get such a good fit to, we were overestimating the peak flow. We still compared the outline, and I'll show you that in a minute. So you can see there from the first plot, the RefH2 CNE calibration, we allowed the base flow parameters, the 2 parameters, to vary, and you can see the original and the fitted base flow there in brown. You can also see the rainfall and the hydrograph, and then the net rainfall in red. And you can see the data for the event at Kidston Mill in blue, and you can see the fit from the hydrological model in red. So that's what we then trusted, and we took forward that net rainfall and inputted it into as a across the whole of the mesh for the HECRAS 2D model as a precipitation boundary. Of course, it would be nice to distribute that, and at the moment, although the software is free and has all these other benefits, it doesn't have the distributed hydrology yet. But that will be coming in version 5.1, which was due to be released this month. And you can see what happens when we add that. So if we look at the hydrograph, we can see here I've missed out the red hydrograph there on the lower plot, which is the HECRAS 2D input simulation, sorry. And essentially that's before we've done a sort of calibration in detail with the roughness. But what we can see is also the model base flow. And it, depending on where you brought that in the domain to understand the full runoff, the full hydrograph, we could see that we could shift the timing of that peak, which isn't quite right. So we're doing very well on the absolute magnitude, but the timing isn't brilliant. So then what we did was we actually brought that base flow in along the main stem of the river as an internal inflow boundary, which you can do in HECRAS. So it has that flexibility to be adding these different boundaries. And then we took that approach forward. So it's probably about as far as you can push this direct runoff and losses approach. You can see here for another, actually this is a range of NFM events, and it's not quite as well modeled. We can get the, we're under predicting the flood peak slightly, and depending on whether we add in a base flow or not, you can see that the start of the simulation is a bit later in the red plot below on HECRAS 2D plot. We can see that we sort of get some aspects of the recession in the secondary event quite well there, and this is before calibration and before we've added a base flow in as well. So you can see that essentially we're getting a reasonable, gave you a bit of confidence that the approach is going to work. Now, for the post event, as I mentioned at the start of the introduction, we didn't have a single peaked event, so it kind of exposes a few limitations of the approach, I suppose. But it also gave us a bit more of a challenge. So you can see on the top again, we've got the RefH2 fitted net rainfall and base flows, and we can see that the overall fit is the red dashed line and model total flow, and you can see the data with some noise there, which is to be expected. I mean, on a good day, a well calibrated or well rated flow estimate might be within 10% if you're lucky. So essentially we're getting up there. You can see the HECRAS 2D calibration. I've cut out more of the intermediate stages on that plot below, and you can see this is the kind of level of fit we can get to that multiple peaked event. Other parts of the catchment, there is more sinuosity to those 3 peaks. We're obviously not getting some of the memory term there, which will be from more of the groundwater processes that's in the observations in the orange dashed line. But in terms of understanding the peak flows, you can see that we can start to try and calibrate. We're still getting some timing out, but but perhaps this is as far as we can go without having a fully integrated model. So how did it look across the entire catchment? So we did then do some calibration of Manning's N. So rather than trying to represent any of the individual NFM features at this point, we're representing them anything with changes to the topography with a DTM or with changes to the Manning's N. Starting on the top left, you can see two inset hydrographs for Middleburn, and you can see that the pre-event we're overestimating the orange dashed observations there. This is the best we could do with whilst maintaining a reasonable fit around the catchment. As you can see at some of the other stations, we're under predicting slightly, and it could be down to rainfall input differences, which we can adjust when we have a variable version. You can see that for the two small scale calibration sites that we looked at, Middleburn and Shipthorburn, we get a reasonable fit, and for both of them, for the post NFM December event, we're getting the peaks about right. And as I say, I think that's about as much as you can do with this type of approach. If we look sort of partly further down the catchment, so at the intermediate scale, so here the catchment area might be about 30 kilometres squared instead of 70 for the whole catchment. At Eddleston Village, we can see that we're getting, if you like, inside the model, or we're getting a reasonable fit as well. So the bottom two left inset hydrographs show you the slight over prediction for the pre-NFM event, which was 2012, and then again a slight over prediction, but not too bad for the triple peak. In fact, here you can see that the data is also showing a greater degree of variability than higher up the catchment. So I think here maybe the conveyance is dominating over those groundwater inputs that may give a more damped response higher up. And then at the very bottom of the catchment, so this is, if you like, the sort of whole catchment calibration point down at Kinston Mill, because there's no rating at March Street in the orange. We can see the kind of level of agreement in terms of the peaks. So had we had and we probably have now had a decent post-NFM event, we might end up with some calibrations that are more like the pre-NFM. You can see there, and this kind of oscillatory behaviour, which doesn't make it easy to model and look at before and after. And then, so as I mentioned earlier, also there's a sort of a further uncertainty analysis into sort of varying the distributed Manning's roughness, representing the NFM. Now, of course, that will change through time as well, and it'll have its seasonality. So as the increased roughness that's already been generated has been calibrated, but as we go forwards over the next sort of 10, 15, 20 years, I understand you get kind of a canopy closure around about 15 years, and then we could, longer term in the future, have those woodlands generating woody debris and creating little debris dams and so on. That will increase the sort of it will slow the flow. So through time, we'd expect these values to change. So there you can see the bottom right, we've got the only sort of spatial footprint from a trash line survey, which is the kind of darker blue area on the left hand as you look at it. So for that event, we captured it, but we were over predicting, and in fact the extent is slightly over predicted in the upstream end. You can see that better in a less 3D plot, but I quite like showing it like that. So we're getting a bit of confidence. So is this the best we can do with this type of approach? Perhaps we could work on it a bit more, work on the mesh in a bit more detail, and use more distributed hydrology as well. We made other comparisons with previous studies. So in Peebles itself, there's been a Peebles flood study report. I didn't have all the details of that, but we have here a sort of outline, a depth grid of the 200 years report event. And we're getting something very similar with this whole catchment model, which takes into account all of those, as I mentioned, nearly 300 million pixels. But we do get some differences. The color scale's not quite the same here, but we can see that in Peebles itself, we've got quite a bit of distributed surface water runoff. We've got, if you look further down the Edinburgh Road, we've got more water accumulating along that than in the other fluvial model, because that was built using a more traditional fluvial approach. Whereas, of course, here we've got direct rainfall onto the DTM. So we can't quite make an exact comparison between the damages and the estimated annual average damages between the two, but we can look relatively. And we'll do that slightly further on. So we're starting to sort of get into the meat and bones of trying to understand, if you've got a model like this, can you start looking at things like synchronization of peaks around the catchment? Can you start thinking of the model as giving you a representation of the whole system? Because that's what ideally this would be useful for, sort of understanding how all that water is being pushed around simultaneously if it's driven by rainfall, rather than by some imposed FEH or FH hydrograph boundaries. So so here what we found was that for the here we're looking at, on the left, we're looking at a pre-NFM, where it's actually a sort of post, it's the 2014 event, and the difference between the time of travel of the time of occurrence of those peaks was about an hour, and on the right about 2 hours, and it agreed largely with the data analysis, and that was for the December 2015 analysis. So yes, but you can see that, you know, are we being a little bit fortuitous with the data there? There's a kind of noisy secondary peak at the end of the 2015 final peak, and then and similarly at the on the left-hand panel of that one, you can see that there's like a little double peak. So in some respects, yeah, we're kind of understanding what's happened with the timing between sites, but perhaps in this instance with these events it's fortuitous, and it would be nice to look at more. But Dr. Andrew Black is analysing that, the timing over many more peaks to understand what it means statistically. So okay, well let's try and understand if we could use this model to understand synchronization, as others have done. And I've zoomed into, this is using RASMapper, which is kind of shows some rather chunky depth grids before we've kind of mapped back onto the half-meter DTM. And the three tributaries we can see there, we've got Cowes Lynn, Middleburn and Shiplaw on the left. And on the right, we've got Eaton Vale, and we've got upstream and downstream of that confluence. And so one of the things that stands out here for this 100-year design event, and this isn't one of the final events, but it's kind of showing us that we've got some sort of small changes in Cowes Lynn and Middleburn. Not a lot going on Shiplaw, but then perhaps we wouldn't expect that yet because that's purely native planting. But as those join the main stem near Early Vale, we have a change in the peak, which is more significant than it looks because the hydrographs upstream and downstream of that confluence are on different scales. But the timing hasn't really changed much from the upstream one. And so well, the question is, you know, would it be better just to slow down the slower rising peaks than slowing down them all? And then that question came up in a number of studies. There was Peter Metcalf's study in Brumpton Catchment, and then I know that in Patterson and Stuart Lane did something similar in modelling the Eden. So yeah, I think if we're doing quite a big bit of change within the catchment, then the understanding of the timing effects is important. And it might be as well that we use this model now it's set up to understand that in more detail. So we could have some what-if scenarios where we do an awful lot on the left-hand tributaries there and nothing on the right, or vice versa, and see where that gets us. Now, just going into sort of understanding representation of NFM, which is a very generic term, and here I'm talking about the representation of the engineered logjams. There's a typical one on the left from Middleburn. There's a photograph from the Street Forum showing some logs that are pretty substantial, but the important thing to note is they extend across the floodplain considerably, and there's also floodplain planting. And when we're looking at this stream here, we're talking a few fractions of meters cubed per second we're looking at in these peak hydrographs. So that's the kind of order of magnitude. And on the left, we can see the broad scale representation if we start representing that whole area as a sort of patch of increased roughness. And there's some nice summaries of that in the recent ADDI publication. We have the added benefit of being able to, of not really having to calibrate many more parameters if we start modeling that as a hydraulic feature over on the right. So on the right, you can see there the granularity of the DTM, so it's really quite impressive in places. And on the right, what we've tried to do is just simply represent it as an embankment with a rectangular slot through it. So the energy losses there will be represented by a kind of Bernoulli effect. We can put in multiple slots to represent porosity. That in itself is a kind of parameter. The geometry is also something to define. I mean, it's quite an ambiguous kind of shape. And we've modeled it with a rectangle. And then, of course, with those, we've got to have weir coefficients for the flow going over, inlet losses, friction, porosity coefficients. So what happens is, yeah, you can end up with some nice representations of those features. And I think this is really a few important points here is that you can see that we've had to refine the mesh around that feature, and then that in itself means that you're going to have to start reducing your time step. So the model runtime for the entire 70 kilometers squared then explodes. And also you can get some nice outputs from the geometry view or from RasMapper in terms of the flow through and above the weir feature. And obviously you're getting some oscillations there which could be removed by reducing the time step even more. So you can see that it swings and roundabouts, and actually one of the things I think is quite important here, and it kind of brings together with sort of thinking coherently with what some of the NERC projects are doing as well, is that perhaps it's more useful to sort of understand what's happening at a very small scale, make a smaller domain model of perhaps a kilometre squared. I'm thinking of Nick Chappell's 1 kilometre catchments and Middleburn here. Then what we can see is that we could model it in detail, we could have sensible run times, and we could have a hope of calibrating those additional 4 parameters. But if you want to represent the system at a big scale and understand the whole system response, then perhaps it's more effective to represent it in a different way and use some of these measured or these calibrated values that are in the literature as mentioned. And that's what we've done. So that second approach is what the broad scale approach is what we've done in that across scale calibration that you saw earlier. Now, I'm not saying you should shy away from representing it in more detail. What I'm saying is that it might be better to apportion, do a portion of your catchment where you've got a lot of NFM, where there is a big shift in some of those parameters, perhaps, where you can hope to detect it, and you can also model it in more detail. And that in itself gives people confidence that if they did that everywhere else in the catchment, then it would be effective. So, so leaving that discussion for now, if we look at some model outputs with and without NFM, and the reason I've done that here is largely not to show that you can use QGIS and so on to visualize it, but to try and understand what's happening during bigger events and so on, and what's happening as we increase friction or as we build structures like the one we just saw. Now, what's happening here in both these instances in different sort of areas in Middleburn and Portmore, we're pushing more water onto the floodplain, and that's what well-designed NFM would hopefully do in order to provide more and more storage at bigger and bigger events. And of course, it's down to, you know, the timing of that. Is it taking that water from the peak and so on, which is where the model comes in useful. So I guess remember what those diagrams look like, or those figures look like, and we'll move on to the next. So here we've actually sort of zoomed in on an area where there's been remeandering. And for that trapezium there, you can see on both of the diagrams and both of the figures, you can see the pre and post NFM or pre-meandering. You can see the volume can be computed quite accurately. So given that HECRAS is mapping back to this ½ meter, it's very useful to be able to integrate that up and understand the change from that work in terms of the absolute volumes that are being, so the volume there has increased by 6% before and after. And, you know, you can compute that quite accurately with these kind of outputs. So again, here what we're hoping is that more of the water will be stored temporarily and cause attenuation further downstream. So let's take it that we're happy with that calibration, and let's look at some design events now and look at RefH. So we've got quite a number of figures here. So starting with the top right, we've got about, I think, 9 design events, and we've got them with and without NFM. So this time we're purely representing the NFM in terms of increased friction from the calibration and also changes to the DTM, which are around places like the meanders at Cringletti and so on. And you can see here that something that I've noted in other studies as well is that we can see that in this instance, the NFM is being effective across flows, which as the flows get bigger and bigger and bigger, we're still doing something. It might not be a lot. And if you look at the table on the bottom, the pink bar charts show you kind of that we're around about 5% peak reduction across those. And now the uncertainty might be, you know, it could be 10% on that. So just bear that in mind. But here what we're seeing is a change of that order. And I went looking around the catchment to see why that might still be happening. And indeed, if you look at those locations where you're pushing water onto the floodplain, some of those areas are more and more expandable. You're driving a flow pathway into an area that can accommodate more and more water. So I think this effect needs a bit more analysis, and we've been looking at it in the QNFM project, and we've been looking at it also in the Connecting the Colne project in Devon. It's something that gives you hope that, okay, we might not have made a massive change to that peak with what we've done here. But if the NFM is designed right, it could reduce across different magnitudes. And there's a physical reason for it. Now, if we go down a paragraph, we're looking at the damages. So in terms of the sort of estimating the damages, the reason why we might look at so many design events is that they each have a probability or an annual exceedance probability. And if we integrate the damages versus probability curve for each of those, we get an estimate of the expected annual damages, or the long-term average annual damages. The difference between those with and without NFM is about 3.4%. So we had a reduction, and you think, oh, well, that's not a lot for all that work that I've done. But if you were to look at that in the context of a whole a scheme lifetime and estimate present value, or the net present value, you can see there that we've estimated that over 15-20 years to be about 600,000. So it can be significant and up there alongside some of the other multiple benefits that you get from NFM. So Angus Pettit, who's been the project manager of this, also did a natural capital assessment for JBA for the Tweed Forum as well. And you can see there that different estimates of carbon and biodiversity. You can also see the uncertainties there. So he's gone better than me and put a range of values there. And that's something that we'll be doing at the end of the study. So you can see that it can have a significant effect, and there's also a reason. If you go back through what I've said, it's if those NFM features, and if we believe the calibration, if those features are working at higher and higher events, then the integral of the damages across all those probabilities is going to be significant. So if it's used in combination with traditional risk reduction methods, then it's a useful thing to do. So you can also see one or two other things in there. We've got the fact that the blue histogram, if you like, in the table, you can see that for very big events, there's not much of a change in the timing, whereas there is with a small one. So there's a slight difference there, and perhaps we might expect that too. So I'll go down to the next slide. So having done all of those calculations and crammed them into that slide, we wanted to expand a bit on what we'd done and how we'd done it, and also provide some sort of user guidance. So at the moment, that's being produced, and it will synthesize what we've written about a sort of decision tree based approach for some of the things that I've summarized earlier on. So we want a proportionate approach for representing NFM, proving models, and when we want to reassess flood risk or appraise flood risk and involve NFM, then why not be a bit more pragmatic and use this kind of approach depending on the scale of the risk. So you might even ask yourself, well, in starting with the decision tree, is the risk quite low? Is a model actually needed at all? And we're awaiting a sort of Syria design guide that could give you best practice for implementing the NFM, and put in place no regrets NFM to complement other measures, if there are any. But if that risk's a bit higher, then you might ask yourself, is there an existing model? And in Eddleston Water, I've not really touched on phase one and how we incorporated earlier models. I can do that. The report outlines which models we've been able to sort of use information from. And that has largely, in this case, been through using meshes that have been generated for parts of where NFM's been implemented and bringing that into the DTM. So is there a model? No. Well, perhaps it's worth, with the cost of LiDAR at this high resolution coming down, collecting that and improving it and building a bit of a similar approach that we've just seen. If there is a model, then why not improve the headwater representation? Perhaps make it 2D only. You can have 2D flow areas flowing directly into a 1D or 1D 2D link model in different packages. And then if you don't have any data, and we've done this in other catchments, and there's no money to collect that data, then it's down to sort of trash line surveys and comparing with existing maps for maps, and also perhaps also the design hydrographs. So, and then we come down to, well, what about the size of the catchment, whether it's small or large? Well, I think this is where I explained fairly succinctly in terms of, well, if it's small, then we could represent those detailed changes, hydraulic units directly in the mesh, refining the mesh, reducing the time step, but we have to bear in mind that for a small scale model that goes into that detail, you may want to have level sensors either side of every single unit in order to be confident in your coefficients that we mentioned. So that might be better done as a demonstrator. That doesn't really come out in the decision tree that well. But perhaps in a large catchment, just modelling and monitoring a portion of that catchment as a demonstrator to show how it's working, and then how people can visualize how it will scale up. At the large scale, yeah, we can use a broad scale approach with larger cells. We can use published parameter shifts, and there's some nice literature there now that's starting to summarize that, and notably the ADDI paper and some of the work coming out of the NERC projects. And you know, we should use whatever data we can get our hands on in terms of understanding and gaining confidence in that model. So in terms of sort of generating that user guide and bringing that into MWES, that we're probably going to have a draft of that ready in sort of May, and hopefully that will provide some useful guidance. In terms of obviously there's other more fully integrated modelling approaches which could be slotted in there if there's time and the modelling skill available. So you could use higher integrated models that include hydrology and overland flows and so on. And some of the techniques that we've been putting forward and publishing on in QNFM have been things like taking the inputs from a distributed hydrological rainfall runoff model like dynamic top model, and inputting those into the channel network, inputting the estimated runoff through time to a continuous simulation, and then using a 2D hydrodynamic model such as HECRAS or TFlow, and understanding hydrodynamics better around features like the ones we've been talking about. That's where we've got to with kind of improving the learning from this study. Obviously, we want to study the uncertainties a bit more, and that will provide you with some perhaps ranges of values to what we've shown. So in summary, hopefully I'm not summarising too early. I think it's 10. Oh yeah, so I've been going 50 minutes. In terms of the broad scale HECRAS 2D model with this RefH losses approach, it's worked reasonably well. I don't think from my modelling experience you're going to get it much better than what we've seen in terms of distributed calibration across scales. I think that the uncertainty analysis will show, you know, a bigger range, and we can look at the distribution of change with and without NFM, allowing for that parameter uncertainty, and we can look at whether that's significant as well. It does illustrate how difficult it is to detect change when NFM is causing some changes, but you've got that underlying environmental variability. So you're trying to detect something which is perhaps a smaller shift than the uncertainty in the observations as well. And it has been sort of calibrated across the different scales and using realistic values of roughness from the literature and the current set of literature. We think it will probably improve a bit further when we can have that distributed representation of hydrological losses, which should be in the next release. And then we could supplement the guidance based on that. That's something that has been undertaken in other modelling packages, and for the reasons I've explained, we're going with HECRAS, and we've got faith that it's got some other important properties. And I think I think that it does give you a system or an approach where you can understand how is that 70 kilometres squared catchment pushing water around, how is it interacting, what are the kind of volumes being pushed around, and how has the hydraulics been influenced. It might be that you know, you could say that within the uncertainty, the amount of water we're pushing onto the floodplain isn't hugely significant, but nonetheless, you've seen that if that carries on at bigger and bigger events, and we design our NFM right so that it accesses those pathways to more expandable storage, then NFM is playing a useful role in making catchments more resilient to climate change. So in terms of different studies having probably much less data than this, we've tried to make a flexible kind of approach to incorporating NFM within a study, and we've shown a pathway of how you might appraise the risk based on that, with a level of model proving that's commensurate with the scale of the risk. So we can't, you know, we can't build this model. There's not often enough funding to take a cross-sectional survey of a catchment this size if it's not been already. Build a 1D, 2D link model. We're talking an awful lot more money than was spent building this demonstrator model. So, but what we can do, we can represent the fine detail in a portion of the catchment. We can demonstrate how it's working. We can have a bit more confidence, and then we can say, well, if we do this in the rest of the catchment, like we've done with the model, so those engineered log jams on Middle Burn were, if you like, calibrated, and then we've had trust that they're working because we've got a reasonable fit with the post-NFM peaks, and so we've used the same values elsewhere in other subcatchments. Then it's a similar phenomenon, really, if you can sort of show things at a small scale and show how they might work at a larger scale. And also bearing in mind that you can use this type of approach to understand the synchronization of peaks, and perhaps just slow down those slower rising peaks rather than trying to slow down the faster rising ones, which might get ahead of the main flood peaks. So it does enable you to do that kind of what if scenario. The user guide's not quite finished yet, and we'll hope to get that out soon. And I think it would be wise to follow the progress of the 3 NERC funded projects, which are also commenting in all these areas. But it's been really nice to work with the partners with their really detailed set of monitoring data, and I know an awful lot of hard work has gone into collecting that data. There's been there hadn't been at the time of writing, if you like, a very big post-NFM event, and I look forward to hopefully being involved with looking at how that could be modelled now that there are some. I know that those bigger events will improve the ratings, and because of not having enough large-scale flow ratings to improve those telemetry, the gauging. And once that's in place, we would reduce the uncertainty in the return periods, which I showed between RefH and the statistical method. So we'd hope eventually to use the Kidston Mill gauge to improve those design hydrology. So with that, I'll leave you with the link to the Tweed Forum's Eddleston project, and I think there's some time for questions.
Thank you very much, Barry. A really interesting and comprehensive presentation. We have, Zoom really needs a digital applause button, doesn't it, really? It's not quite the same when you're doing it here. But we've got a few questions that have come through, so I'll read them out to you. Some people have done them anonymously, some have put their names on. So first question that came in was, when presenting maps, what cutoff depth are you using where you show no flooding?
That might typically be a centimetre. I'd have to check across those. Okay. It might be slightly less.
Cool. Right, move on to the next one. You presented some maps with an urban area. Isn't that much more likely to be incorrect using a 2D surface flow model given urban structures and local drainage systems?
Yes, I'd agree with that. We are trying to model NFM. When we went in the business of modelling SUDs and so on, although they can have a big effect. As soon as the new functionalities available in HECRAS, we'd be able to alter the the local net rainfall having a drainage factor, much like in the surface water map generation. We weren't trying to do that in this study.
Okay. Paul Webster says, hi Barry, many thanks for the presentation. I was surprised at the consistent reduction in flow peaks across all return periods. I was expecting there to be a reduction for higher return periods. Have you any thoughts on this, e.g. is this due mostly to the increased flood storage volume?
Well, I think in this instance, some of these NFM features have been designed quite well. You saw the photograph of one of them in that they are trying to understand the mechanism. They were trying to push more water onto the floodplain and keep it there. I would have, from the Dadson type paper, you'd expect at lower return periods actually that it would be more effective at lower return periods. So I suppose it is slightly surprising. It could be a facet of the modelling that we haven't yet uncovered. But when I look into details, I typically find in some, quite a lot of areas in riparian land where we've promoted more connectivity with the floodplain, more water's being pushed there. So you can see, and I've got some more sort of evidence for that from other studies. We can see more and more, we could see it in a couple of those plots I showed, more and more storage as the flows get bigger.
Okay. Patrick Taylor asks, what is the reason for not using 1D modelling and purely 2D? And generally, which NFM measures were used for this study, catchment?
Okay, well, I guess if you're going to use, if you've got all this wonderful 2D information that's more and more available from SEPA and the Environment Agency and other partners, then you're going to get a better picture of the truth of what the topography is doing than an interpolation between 1D cross sections and using panel roughness and so on. I think the future of this kind of whole catchment modelling really is to understand how the different flow accumulation pathways are interacting continuously. The model presented really, you can only look at design events and sort of single peaked events. It would be difficult to do continuously. So, and in terms of the NFM represented, I think I sort of outlined that in terms of it was in terms of woodland, in terms of hydraulic structures and so on. We did do some other scenarios that haven't been presented here in terms of representing improvements to soil structure just purely by increasing the soil storage. We did that as a sort of global change. We've often done that as a percentage change to distributed hydrological parameters. And so in the models that you've seen, we haven't been doing that for the tree planting, but it's something else that should be represented in the future. They of course have, woodland will have an effect on friction, it'll have an effect on increasing infiltration rates, and it'll have effect on wet canopy evaporation rates.
Okay, and we'll probably finish here with one where we step away from the modelling detail for a bit. Ashling asks, what has the response to the project been like from community or landowners?
I think the person to answer that would be probably won't be able to talk on Zoom right now, but I think Luke would probably be able to give the best response to that. It might be that that's one where we can have a kind of written response, but I understand that it's been well received, and that I also understand from Chris that there's been quite a lot of educational events in schools and so on where it is well received.
Okay, and we'll do another one quickly that's kind of linked into that. David Bassett asks, how important are larger land use changes and naturalisation as opposed to localised NFM features?
Nice question. That's something that I wanted to actually point out was, you know, there does need a lot of NFM has been quite small scale. There's a growing amount of it. But I think we do need to be ambitious about how much of the riparian land is used, and I think that goes into the whole payment for public goods argument. So I think if we're thinking about future land use management and so on, I think in England the new ELM scheme and so on, if we can actually pay people to store larger volumes of water, then that would be a way forward.
Okay. There have been a few other questions coming in. We'll wrap up there. I'll hand over to Alice in a second. Would people be okay to contact you through the links on the presentation if they wanted their questions answered?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Excellent. Cool. If I hand over to you, Alice, now.
Wonderful. Well, I just want to echo Ollie's comments again, just to say thank you so much for such an engaging, interesting presentation, Barry. Yes, we really do need a digital applause button. So thank you very much indeed. We thank you very much to all the attendees for joining us this evening, and hope that you can attend our upcoming events as well. Our next one is going to be held on the 27th of May, and this will be a talk by Rachel Fox of Scottish Water, looking at Scottish Water's approach to innovation in wastewater, exploring the drivers and areas of focus for the current programme and how innovation will feature in future programmes. So yes, thank you again, Barry, and thank you everyone to join.